The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our E3 Plus training webinar. E3 Plus is the premier software solution for analyzing the macroeconomic and demographic impacts of any initiatives related to the energy and environmental sectors. And our presenters will be showing you some of the useful features within the model. Our associate, Philip Meneghini, will be presenting, and our analyst, Jeffrey Dykes, will answer all questions at the end. Phil has been working at Remy for 2 years and specializes in workforce development in the New England region. Jeff has been providing support to clients for 7 years as an analyst. If you have any questions, you can ask them at any time in the question box, and we'll try to answer them all at the end. But if we run out of time, we'll make sure to reach out to you after the conclusion of the webinar. Take it away, Phil.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and I'm honored to be continuing the model training series with E3 Plus, the new version 3.0. I'll be doing it with Jeff. Jeff will be piping in during the model demonstration, walkthrough, and answering all the questions at the end. Yeah, without further ado, I'll just get started. Let's see, there we go. A little bit of a lag. First, just to lay out how I'm going to, do this model training, I'm going to start with the topic overview. So, for some context in the model, we're going to be doing a demonstration in the model, looking specifically at the environmental portion of the model, so looking at how the economy impacts the environment, as well as the environment impacting the economy. So I'm going to go over those topics, and then I'm going to go right into the model. And show some of the new features that we have with the new version, and then from there dive into the demos into some applicable examples. And then at the end we'll have the Q&A, of course. I noticed that a lot of people that registered, some of them don't have E3 Plus. A lot of this is geared towards users, but a lot of the people that registered also are users of some of our other models, but to give you some background and people some background to get an idea of what's the difference and what does E3 Plus have that other models don't. E3 Plus, E3, the 3E stands for energy, environment, and economy. So it focuses on energy and environmental issues and how they're intertwined with the economy. So a big thing is that we can look at power plant construction and operation maintenance profiles. So we custom made operation maintenance, IO tables for a couple different power plants, nuclear, solar, natural gas, coal, on and offshore wind. We also have the option to make a custom industry and a custom power plant. But these are really useful when analyzing energy policy and looking at environmental issues. Looking at constructing and operating these various energy and power plants. And then we also have an energy consumption and carbon dioxide emissions module. So this looks at the results page. You can see how energy consumption is changing in the different sectors, as well as how carbon dioxide emissions is changing across the economy. So this is very useful to get an idea how the energy and emissions environment is changing. And then, we have a couple other things. I'm not going to touch on these as much. There's a resiliency module, and there's a carbon tax scenario. And what we're really going to be looking at is that emissions cost policy variables that looks at the social cost of different emissions being released and how does it impact, how does this environmental concern impact the economy. Did some, looking at, some of the newer coal-fired plants that are being closed down. I believe Martin Lake Power Plant is starting to ramp down operations. It might have closed down already this year, but it's one of the biggest coal-fired plants in Texas. It's a 2,250 megawatt coal power plant located in Texas, and it produces a lot of emissions, especially sulfur dioxide emissions. 48,000 tons of sulfur dioxide emissions in 2021. And this is the largest volume of sulfur dioxide pollutants in the entire United States. And sulfur dioxide has various health impacts as well as environmental impacts that damage and cause a lot of hospital visits and health problems that negatively impact the economy. It also harms the environment. It can contribute to acid rain. It harms trees and foliage and decreases growth, which will take away from an amenity factor. So these emissions do have a big impact on the economy. And in the scenario I'm going to be looking at what would be the impact of increasing sulfur dioxide emissions in New York City. And then the second scenario I'm going to be looking at is how the policy and the economy impact the environment. And I work in New England, as Brian said, and a lot of these states have new energy climate plans. I have a couple up here, but a huge theme of all these is electrify and then make that electricity green. So, just looking at the Rhode Island one, they're looking at, trying to make their electricity 100% green. And the way basically to tackle and reduce emissions is to make everything as electricity dependent as possible. And then once we make that electricity green, we'll get rid of a lot of emissions. Like in New York, they just released a huge plan with the Climate Action Council, and it's a big undertaking, but that's the big theme of their plan. So we're going to be looking at a scenario where we look at what's going to be the impacts of electrification in terms of emissions as well as on the general economy. And from here, I'll just jump right into the new model. So this is the new interface for REMI E3 Plus version 3.0. It's a nice, clean new interface. It looks a lot different. So, people who currently use it probably see a bunch of differences, and other users of our other models probably see a lot of differences also. We cleaned up this interface a lot. It's a nice, clean, relaxing interface now. A lot of white space. It's not as busy as the old interface. And it really just has an emphasis on this one button, which is really why you're using REMI to begin with. New regional simulation. So this is what you use when you want to start a new what-if scenario. And then, we even tidied this up a little bit and put this into one button here. So if you want to look at your regional controls and, your national simulations, but in your national control, you can go here. So as you're aware, all of our forecasts are based off of a baseline forecast. And you have the option basically to go in there and change the baseline forecast if some of our baseline data isn't lining up exactly with what you want, or if you have some better data available, then you're more than welcome to use that. But I guess we'll just jump into the regional control real quick. Takes a little bit to load. This is a bigger model. But yeah, so the regional baseline hasn't, changed too much. So the regional, control that we're using, that we're building all our forecasts off of, the big difference is that we, upgraded all the demographic and economic information for this year. So with this annual update, we're allowed to, we can forecast out a lot farther. So the big difference here is going to be that we can forecast now all the way out to 2080 as opposed to 2060, which is what we could do before. And then I guess I'll highlight in this regional control, for those who are not as familiar, this regional control, this is basically the forecasted employment levels and forecasted population levels in this given region all the way out to 2080. And for reference, we're using a New England model. It's actually National Grid's model. I'll look more at that later, but right now I'll just run into some of the unique features to E3 Plus. So in E3 Plus, if we go over this in the output tab in the baseline forecast, we have forecasts also for carbon dioxide emissions. And this is, you can look at total carbon dioxide emissions. You can look at it in different sectors. You can look at it in the residential sector, commercial sector, industrial, transportation sector, and you can look at what in the different fuel types where these emissions are coming from. So, petroleum, natural gas, coal, electricity, and then total. And the units here are in million metric tons, but we can change that if we want. And we have a nice baseline forecast also that goes all the way out to 2080 for the carbon dioxide emissions. We also have the social cost of carbon. So this looks at how carbon dioxide emissions are impacting the economy. So this is kind of that social cost that we talked about in the PowerPoint briefly. We can see that in all those sectors again, and all those different fuel types. And we have that all the way out to 2080 as well. And then finally, the other E of this, the energy portion of this, we can look at how energy consumption is changing in each of these different sectors and each of these fuel types as well. So this is very useful as well to get an idea of generally where your region is trending in terms of emissions and energy consumption. And then, just to give you an idea, so new regional control, if we want to change this, we can go in here and we can actually change the baseline forecast if any of those numbers don't look accurate or if you have a better idea of what they should be. And then I guess I'll also pinpoint, we also added this new pinned tab to the front. So this just adds more customization to the software. So before, we used to have a lot of different buttons here. Now you can pick what you want here in the pinned tab. So we have here the standard regional control and the standard national control. And then we have a couple recent here, which are some of the simulations I'm going to show. And, we can, pin and unpin these as we see fit. We can also do this with various other settings that I'll show. So, here are our forecasts, but I'll go right over to the this has some of the new preferences and some of the new settings that you can change. So, some of these preferences and shortcuts you can just pin as well over to that shortcut, so it can be right on your landing page as soon as you open the software. But notably, one of the big things that we added also to the software, and functionality we've added to the model with new version 3.0 is that we can actually export and integrate with the database. So we can export forecasts to I believe SQLite, a couple MySQL, Microsoft Access. There's a couple that we have easy integrations for, and we've added that in. And I'm not going to do that now. It requires a little bit more involved. You have to go into the command line in order to activate it, but that is a feature. So after this webinar, if this is something that you want to look into doing and exporting results into a database, then that's something that's new and is added into the model. But we have a bunch of different settings here and tools here that are really useful. Some of these are new, some of these are old. The export is probably the biggest thing here that's new. But we have a lot of preferences here. I believe we've added a couple more. So if we want to go to more preferences, I believe we have some new preferences. You can look at the results. We can modify some more settings here. So we can add more decimal precision. We can change the color, the map colors and the gradients. We can also do something as simple as adding 1,000 separator. We can also look and filter through what results we want to see. So if we want to see results for all the regions, or if we want to see the results for all the industries, we can pick if we want to do a collection or aggregation of industries. So we've just really added more customization to it. You can also change the units that you're looking at when you're looking at the results, which is very useful as well. So you can adjust these to whatever you prefer. Some more of these up here, you can change the map color preferences. So you could change what color layout you want. A lot of customization, and then you can export these as a REMI settings file, and then you can import them as a REMI settings file also. So you could just set these settings and you can save them and then upload them if they somehow get reset or someone else uses the model. So this is very useful. Some more customization over here. You can make custom variables, and that's a little bit more involved. But we have that functionality over here. You can also define custom aggregations of industries, regions, commodities. So this is really useful to make shortcuts for when you're running simulations. You can take a collection of regions that you're looking at, and you can basically save it as an aggregation for something that you can always select on the input side. So if you want to increase employment in a specific region, which is like a 3-county region, you can just make that in this setting. You can make that, and I actually did that here for New York State. So this is a New England model. As I said, New York State is split up into Long Island, a couple different sections in upstate New York, New York City, and I basically I took it and go in here and see I put it all together. So that's useful for just adding more customization. And then by industry, for an industry like the electric vehicle industry, there isn't a clear NAICS code, so you can group together some manufacturing industries like electrical component manufacturing, motor vehicle body manufacturing. You can put those together to make a custom industry profile and have that saved here as well, so you can manipulate it on the variable side. So this is very useful. And then finally we have the model details, which is really useful. But I'm not going to dive into all this, but probably what is most of interest is the fuel weight data. So you can look at how the different industries are using fuel across electricity, natural gas, residual. So this is very useful to get an idea. And this can also be changed, but you can see how the different industries use fuel, which is most of interest if you're using the E3 Plus model. And I'll just show you the general regional layout. So this gives you, this is the model that we're using. So it splits New York up into a couple of regions, and then we have Massachusetts broken up into 4 regions. Then we have Rhode Island. 10 region model, so a bigger model than, actually pretty typical, but I'm used to running like smaller models like 3 regions. But yeah, this is the model that we're going to be using for the demonstration. So that's a lot of what's new in terms of the interface. But if you want to check out more, you can go right over here to the question mark down here. You can look at what's new in E3 Plus version 3.0. Click that, and then you'll get a window here that'll show you all the new updates, and we'll go through all the different things that's a good resource if you want to explore what's exactly new with this new update as well. But I'll start jumping into the simulations to give you an idea of how you could use E3 Plus. So first I'm going to start with a scenario that I've already run. I'll just click on it, and we'll skip over to the inputs real quick. Just give it a second to load. So this is the newest portion. This is also very new. Like I said, we're going to look at how the economy impacts the environment, and specifically in the context of electrification. So we're going to look at a scenario of in this model, if we replaced $500 million of money spent towards gas and make it into electricity. So this would be on the consumer side, but this would look at what if we shift away from using gas and if we just use electricity, not even looking at if we make this electricity more green. Let's just see if this has a meaningful impact and will lead to reduced emissions. So in order to construct this scenario, I would like to point out, this is part of the new interface as well. When you start a new regional simulation, we have a new search bar, and this search bar has a lot of new functionality. You can see here it has a history that we didn't have before. We've made the search bar have a lot more applicability, and it's a lot easier to use. So we have some history of what I've been looking at before, so detailed industry employment, power plant construction. These are some of the variables we're going to use, but we also have REMI suggestions. So some of these are, some of these are policy variables, so employment, sales. Some of these are specific to E3 Plus. We can look at emissions costs, which is also what we're going to look at. And then you can look at a carbon tax scenario as well, which we're not going to look at, but it shows some of the E3 plus functionality. You can also look at the model linkages. So you can look at, well, what's the framework of the model. I always love looking at this diagram to get an idea, interpreting results, and getting a general sense of how how variables are flowing through the model when you're running a simulation. So this is a good way to get an idea of why you're getting certain results. But that's nice that we have that suggested right there. And we can also go back to the old all variables for people that when constructing their scenario, they just want to look at all the variables and based on all the variables, the huge list of variables we have, construct their scenario from there. They can do that. We've also added here, so usually you can look at them sorted from A to Z, but now we have we can sort it by concept. So we can look at all the consumption economic levers that we have, all the demand function, all the demand changes that we have, the demographic changes that we can have, that we can input as shocks into the model. Specifically, you can look at the E3 plus ones. You can look at the power plant construction, custom power plant construction and operation, employment. There's a bunch of different variables here. And then, if you don't like the search bar, some people aren't fond of search bars. We also have the old tile interface, which is a little bit more busy, but some people prefer that. So that's also a function. We can also switch over to that. And I guess featured, we can kind of show what's specific to E3 plus. So like I was saying, we have the power plant construction. So we can build a power plant. We have custom industry profiles for coal-fired, natural gas, solar, wind, offshore, onshore, nuclear. We've done lots of reports with these different industry profiles, whether it's nuclear, coal-fired, any of these. And then we also have the option for custom power plant construction. So, these are the traditional ones that we've always had in E3 plus, the 6 main power plants. As more technology comes along, I'm sure that we'll add more, but these are the ones that we have right now that we have as custom industry profiles that you can input. And you can input this on the construction side as well as the operation and maintenance side. You can also look at emission costs, which is what we're going to be looking at as well. It's another economic lever that we can look at. So we can change the amount of a certain emission. So that's carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, fine particulate matter, and then particulate matter. We can change how many of those there are in tons or metric tons. We can increase emissions and see what the economic impact is of that. So that's very useful. And you can also look at the carbon tax scenario, like I was saying. So we can look at what is going to be the impact of carbon tax. And we have a couple variables that we need to use. Production cost is probably the biggest one here for constructing that scenario. And then also we can change energy prices and demand by fuel cost. So whether that's electricity, natural gas, or residual, we can change their price and see what the economic shock is, as well as their demand. And that can be done on the industry side or on the consumer side as well. So it's a little bit about E3 plus. I believe I just closed out of it, so I'll go back into it. But I'm just going to jump over to that first scenario that I was talking about. So New England, I digress. But so New England is going to, the select states of New England in this model are going to increase, they're going to increase their consumption of electricity by $500 million and decrease, a one-to-one matching of gas, motor vehicle fuels, lubricants, fluids. They're going to decrease the same amount. It's going to be in all the regions. So, I have the reduction in gas consumption and the increase in electricity consumption. And it's going to be in the consumer spending variable. And to note also, and another feature that we have here is that we can add notes to different policy variables. So if you want to add a note as to why you added it, You can say consumer side or something that's important. Consumer side shock for remember later. You can do that now, so that's really useful. So you can remember why you put that variable there. This is a pretty simplistic scenario, so might not need to do that. But if you have 10, 15 variables and it's a pretty involved simulation, you might want to put a note there. And then this forecasting will go out to 2080 with the new model and the new baseline forecast that we released. So if we go over to the results, they're positive, really positive actually. We're seeing an increase in over 1,000 jobs actually across all regions. Very positive. And yeah, we're seeing that pretty sustained out into the forecast. An increase in population, increase in labor force. We're seeing positive numbers across the board. So it looks like this policy, electrification in general, is leading to more economic activity. So that's a real interesting insight. Then if we want to look at employment by industry, so we can look at, well, which industries are actually benefiting from this. We can look at that. So if we want to look in 2025, which industry is gaining the most, saying, construction, electric power generation, not surprisingly, is gaining the most in terms of employment. We're artificially increasing demand for it, which is, as expected. And if we want to look at which one's the big loser, so retail trade, that requires gas, a lot of gas in terms of shipping different items, as well as getting to the store and actually participating in it. So we're seeing big declines in the retail trade, not surprisingly. Also, petroleum and products manufacturing decreasing a huge amount as well. Truck transportation, not surprising, they're losing jobs because of this electrification. But in total, we're seeing positive numbers for employment, so that's good. And then I'll just jump over to the the E3 Plus results, which would be interesting. So the real test is usually as economic activity increases, there's more jobs, more people are driving places, there's more industry going on, so to say. So it means that there's usually more emissions that come with that. So we'll see. Electricity is a lot cleaner though than gas. So there's going to be a reduction as well. Even though the economic activity is increasing, we're going to see a reduction in emissions. As you can see up here, this is the total amount. We're seeing that's reducing by about 1.5 million metric tons, which is really a pretty sizable impact, and that goes up to 1.6 million metric tons. So that's not something that's a sizable decrease in emissions. And we can look at, as I shown the baseline forecast, we can look at the changes in these emissions or the reductions in these emissions by each fuel type. So petroleum is decreasing the most. We're seeing a small increase in natural gas. That's probably from the increase in economic activity. That's probably what that's being caused by. And then we're seeing the biggest increase in electricity. The good thing is that we're not seeing an increase in coal at all. Coal is not contributing more and creating more emissions. But now we can look at the different sectors and look at this more. But I'm just going to look at the total amount and the total numbers. And then looking at the social cost of carbon, that's reducing as well. Since carbon dioxide emissions are decreasing, it makes sense that there would be less of an impact on society and the economy from this. So we're seeing in total there's a decrease in the social cost of carbon. So that's real positive. And then energy consumption. This will be interesting. So we're seeing energy consumption decrease across the board, mainly led by petroleum, and then that small increase in natural gas as we saw in the emissions. We're seeing a slight decrease and then increase in coal, and then a decrease again in the long run. So in the long run, coal energy consumption is going to go down, so that's positive. Then we're going to see, electricity. We're going to see electricity is increasing the most and leading this and making up for a lot of this lost energy consumption in petroleum. So, overall, this is something that's counterintuitive. Usually, as economic activity increases, emissions increase, energy consumption increases. We have the opposite here. So this is a very positive policy. And we can look more at the other results, but I wanted to highlight some of the features real quick in the results that you can use. So we have this new search bar here as well, and this new search bar is on the policy variable side, but also on the result side. So you can search for different results here. So you can increase, so you can look at, if you wanted to look at, well, let's look at capital and actual stock. We can look at increases or changes in capital, labor and capital demand. We can look at a graph here. This is a good shortcut if you want to look at a specific result, but you can't find it in this huge menu. You can just search it right here and you can get a nice graph. Also we have these, you can go back and forth here. So if you wanted to go back to another result or what you were looking at before, another graph, you just hit the back here, go back to the previous result that you were looking at. You can go forward as well, so you go back to the one that you just viewed. So if you want to go back to the capital stock diagram to look at that, you could also go back to the previous result they're doing for us. This is easy. If you don't want to lose a result, you can just easily click the back or forward button. So that's a real good result. And then again, we have this more customization. So we go to the default settings up here. You can look at the display, the fields, the units, all similar to what we were looking at before. You can change the decimal precision, color layout. You can look at changes in the fields. You can look at you can change the units as well. So similar to that other preferences toolbar that we looked at before, you can do all of that on the results page right here with the default settings right there. I'll jump over to the other scenario that I was talking about. So now let's look at the social cost of sulfur dioxide emissions. So I'm just going to jump over. So I have it already preloaded. I'm looking at the scenario of if kind of unrealistic, but I figured it would be, for the sake of a what if scenario in lieu of Remy. I figured I would look at the scenario of a coal-fired power plant opening up in New York City. So this would look, I took numbers from, and the reason why I talked about the Martin Lake power plant is that's one of the biggest power plants, and I also want to run a simulation with a huge amount of emissions to see what it really does to the economy and see the dynamics of the model. So I purposefully took the numbers of the amount of emissions that were coming out from the Martin Lake, which is about 45,000 tons a year of sulfur dioxide, and I input that in the specific region. So if we look at the input variables here, we can see we looked at what is going to be the emission costs of sulfur dioxide, New York City with 45,000 tons for 2023, all the way, every single year, all the way out to 2080. And so if you, I input this, if you wanted to do this manually, you could go over to the emissions costs, just show you generally what I did. So then, I looked at all the other emissions that we have, and I did pick sulfur dioxide, picked tons, and then I picked the region that I wanted to do, so New York City, just to give you an idea of how I did that. So it's one variable, very straightforward. We also have a note here, captures the economic impact from release of sulfur dioxide, health, environmental impacts, etc. So I'm just going to go and skip over the results since I already ran this scenario. And, as expected, there's a pretty big negative impact. This is going to be a huge coal-fired plant, so this is going to be the biggest in the country. So, we're looking at a decrease of, almost over 2,000 jobs as we keep zooming out. Yeah, like 2,500 jobs in 2079. we're going to lose basically just from the emissions alone from this power plant. So that's not even looking at, that's just from the emissions. So I wonder how many people that this is hiring, but never mind just the environmental impacts and how that'll impact the economy. This is estimating that's going to be 2,500 jobs. So that's a very sizable impact. And it's interesting because if we go into some of the E3 plus and the carbon and the emissions results, since this is sulfur dioxide and this is another emission that we're not looking at, we see that since economic activity is going down and people are leaving the region from this decreased amenity because there's all these pollutants in the air, we're also seeing that carbon dioxide emissions are going to decrease. So carbon dioxide is going to decrease largely because of the negative economic impact that these emissions are going to cause. So people are leaving, less economic activity, less emissions, but still not good. And similar picture with the social cost of carbon, that's going to be decreasing because the emissions are going to start going down because there's less economic activity, because it's less of a desirable place to live. And then if you want to look at energy consumption also is down across the board because there's less industrial activity happening. So as expected. And then, I guess, we have a lot of time in this webinar, so I put together one more scenario also to look at, well, what's a more all-encompassing? And again, this is, very much like dummy scenarios, what-if scenarios, just for demonstration's sake. I figured, what if we added in and used our custom industry profiles for building a coal manufacturing plant or coal power plant, and looking at the operation maintenance and factoring that into the equation, and also putting as an input variable those emissions. So looking at the cumulative economic impact after we look at how bad the emissions are going to be impacting the economy, we can look at well, what jobs are those going to bring, and is it going to be net positive after we have all these negative consequences from all the emissions and environmental damage that's going to cause. So the third scenario I have here is a little bit more of a comprehensive analysis and kind of gives you an idea of how you could start constructing these scenarios and energy scenarios and get a better idea of how they're going to impact the regional economy. So I guess before I jump straight into the results, wait a second, sorry, it's taking a second to load. I'll go back over to the input page just to give you an idea of how I'm constructing this. So I'm looking at, if we look at going back to the original interface I was showing before with all the different E3 plus, specific and unique features, we could look at power plant construction. So we're going to look at, what if we build a power plant, a coal-fired power plant in New York, and operate and maintain it. We start building, let's say today, until 2026. And so it's 4-year construction period, and then we maintain it all the way out to 2080. And from that point after construction, we input that sulfur dioxide emissions and see how the social cost reacts with the positive economic effect of bringing new jobs and industry to the regional economy. So, we would pick coal-fired plant, and we would increase, we would build it, it's a coal-fired plant. We would increase it by, usually I would use fixed national, account for inflation, 2020 to, could do this in any number of units. In the case that I'm doing, I would use it in billions because it would be a big plant if we're talking about, thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide being released every single year. And then we pick the region. So I did the rest of New York. So that's kind of next to the Hudson River and getting up into a little bit of upstate New York. So, it wouldn't be realistic really for that plant to open up in New York City without congested it is. So I figured I would run this scenario a little bit more in upstate New York. So with that in mind, I'll go over to the input list. So I have that construction here, $1.8 billion every single year, so this is going to be a huge plant. I have those emissions costs the same, 45,000 tons of sulfur dioxide released every single year. So this is comparable to the Martin Lake power plant. And then we're also going to have the operation and maintenance here. So every single year, once it's finished, it's going to be $200 million. Every single year is going to be needed to operate and maintain this plant. And I got some of these numbers. They're really estimates from basically the Martin Lake power plant. They're kind of dummy numbers, but I'll give you an idea, a general idea of how you can factor emissions costs and look at our custom industry profiles to build a power plant and see how the emissions are impacted by the new energy that's available, as well as the emissions that come from it. So if we go into the results, we can just poke into the E3 Plus results again, or the key results. I guess we can open up a graph. We've been looking at the table. So this has always been the model, but we have a bunch of different table and chart options, which is very useful when wanting to visualize data or get a better sense. These tables can be a little bit difficult to discern what exactly is going on unless somebody tells you what's going on. It's also kind of difficult to see the different rows and columns. So I'm just going to open up a line graph real quick. So, we're seeing that that original construction, we're investing billions of dollars. So there's a bunch of construction jobs coming in, and, construction is very cyclical. So a bunch of people are coming in. This is the labor force here. There's a lot of lines here, population here, and we're seeing the economic indicators here. So we're seeing up here total employment, 32,000 jobs. So that's a lot of jobs that this construction is going to bring. And we can go over here, just good to know, because even this graph can be difficult to parse with all these lines here. We can go here and uncheck all the ones that we really aren't interested in. So if we want to just look at employment, we can look at total employment, or let's do population, labor force, GDP. We'll get rid of value added. We'll get rid of personal income. We'll get rid of the price index. We'll get rid of real disposable personal income and disposable personal income, and just keep it to employment, population, labor force, GDP. I'll get rid of output also, and then real disposable income per capita. So this kind of cleans up the graph a little bit, so you can get a better idea instead of looking at a bunch of looks almost like spaghetti with all those lines on the chart. So we've got total employment up here, and then it dips way down. This is 0 right here, so it dips way down, and dips way down from the emissions costs that we're seeing, goes up a little bit, and then goes back down again. And same with the labor force. The population is all following these construction jobs essentially, and GDP also jumps up a little bit and then just falls back down. And kind of, if we look at the actual numbers, if we want to go back to the table to get an idea of, since this is all very close to 0 here, you can see that in the long run, we're seeing a slight increase in employment, but we're seeing the population drop, and we're seeing that sustained. So the population is going to drop by 2,600 people, and we're going to lose about 500 jobs in the long run in the 2080 forecast. And so those jobs that are used to operate and keep the coal-fired plant going are basically are not going to keep up with the jobs that are lost from the emissions, is what the model is telling us essentially. So, and then, with the reduced economic activity, we're going to see, there's an increase in carbon dioxide emissions originally, and then it drops down and kind of stays level for most of the forecast. And it's going to be a similar picture with these other indicators with E3 Plus that we can look at. So the social cost is going to jump way up during those construction jobs, those first few years, and then drop down. And then we're seeing the same thing with energy consumption. So they jump way, way up because it's a huge investment to build that plant. But as soon as it's built, we're seeing really a net negative and negative effect in energy consumption and all these main indicators in the long run. So if we look at 2080 here, we're seeing a huge reduction in energy consumption. Interesting scenario, kind of a little bit of how you can start looking at and thinking about these different scenarios, and gives you an idea of how you could use E3 Plus when looking at the environment and looking at building, different energy power plants and weighing the different pros and cons. And that gives a general idea of the new model, some of the new interface, some of the new customizable features. Big thing is that we've just overhauled the interface, if you're going to take anything away. And of course, you can go into the documentation, into the What's New tab down at the bottom if you want to learn more. So that's very helpful. You can also, please reach out to us if you have any questions, like exporting to a database. There's a couple things that I kind of touched on briefly that I would suggest for you to reach out to us to get more information on. But all of it's in the documentation if you want to do it all yourself. And this gives you an idea of what's new and how you could use E3 Plus a little bit more. We didn't touch on the resiliency module, which is really useful when analyzing different energy grids and seeing which are the most resilient. We didn't touch on the carbon tax scenario, so we can look at carbon tax, and E3 Plus has been used in those different scenarios, in past projects. We just didn't really touch on it with this webinar. That's going to be it for the model training. Happy to answer your questions. Me and Jeff will answer all of them to the best of our ability. And yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you for the great presentation, Phil. If you would like assistance with E3 Plus or any other REMI products, please reach out to info@remi.com, info@remi.com again, and we'll gladly set up a support meeting with our analysts. If you have any questions about this webinar in general, you can also reach out to the same email address. Again, thank you for attending the webinar, everybody, and have a great day.